Enjoyed the conference, and I'm sure you'll enjoy it this morning. Governor Hunt and I flipped a coin to recognize our Latin American friends that are here today, and since I'm from Miami, I won. So before we start with the introduction of our great speaker, I'd like to recognize a few of the universities that are here participating in the conference. Politécnico Gran Colombiano of Bogotá is here. Universidad del Istmo in Panama City, Panama. Universidad Empresarial Siglo XXI from Córdoba, Argentina. Instituto Profesional Providencia Santiago from Santiago en Concepción, Chile. Y Universidade Veiga de Almeida, Rio de Janeiro. Welcome them all to the conference.
First thing I want to do this morning is welcome Molly Broad, the president of American Council on Education. I don't know where Molly is, but we're thrilled to have her here. She's got on a red top. One person told me this morning he'd never been to a conference like this one. And then another one said, we got to have a second conference in which we demonstrate all of this, actually see it happening, and maybe we can think about that. This morning we want to talk about the economy in particular, and it's the subject that's on the minds of all Americans, as we know. And we're going to hear a lot from our great speaker first thing this morning about how higher education has provided so much growth and prosperity and jobs. And you know that it does a good bit of that here, but it can be a lot more. So this morning I'm delighted to introduce the great Prime Minister that many of you have already spoken to. Australia, a country of 22 million people, leads the world in the utilization of higher education as a generator of foreign exchange. On a relative basis, Australia has far more foreign students than the United States. International students account for 26% of all of that country's higher education enrollment. Higher education is, in fact, Australia's #1 service export and #3 overall. Australian higher education institutions have established campuses across Asia and are now moving around the world, vastly increasing the influence of the nation far beyond its population size and its economic and military power. Much of this remarkable success was due to the vision and leadership of John Howard, Prime Minister of Australia for 11 years, from 1996 to 2007, the second longest tenure in Australia's history. As Prime Minister, he stood firm in the belief that a strong educational system was key to attracting talent and ensuring Australia's prosperity in the 21st century. He said, and I quote, "We're in a global war for talent. Australia must work hard to retain and attract our share of the best and the brightest, the researchers, the scientists, the innovators, the risk takers, who will generate the ideas of a rising Australia." John Howard's government also had other extraordinary accomplishments, including paying off the entire national debt. That's a good idea. Which had made Australia paying it off has made Australia one of the most fiscally sound countries in the world. During his tenure, Australia also experienced the strongest economic growth and the lowest unemployment rate in 30 years. Prime Minister Howard is a superb example of a leader who clearly understands the value of market-driven educational solutions. I want to also say to you, this man is a great friend of America, and his country is. And we cherish and are thrilled about that relationship, Mr. Prime Minister. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming former Prime Minister of Australia, John Howard.
Well, thank you very much, Governor, and Governor Jeb Bush. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank the Governor for his very, very kind and generous remarks. It is a great delight to be back in the United States. I have something of a personal connection with the city of Dallas. Our youngest child, our second son, has lived and worked in this city now for about 4 years, and for personal as well as other reasons, I welcome very warmly the opportunity of being here, and I particularly welcome the opportunity of sharing some experiences of my country with the challenge of funding and growing the higher education system. It's a challenge for all countries. The perspectives I hope I might bring to the conference are not unique, but they do have certain characteristics which I hope will assist you as you deal with the subject. A head of government has many experiences. Some of them occur in a historic context and are remembered in a public sense. Many of them are personal encounters which are very touching, and one of those which is particularly relevant to the conference that I'm addressing this morning took place for me in Singapore about 18 months after I'd been elected Prime Minister. And I was attending a reception which comprised about 600 or 700 of the alumni of Australian universities, citizens of Singapore who'd studied at Australian universities over the years. And I was talking to one of the professors at the University of Singapore, and he was recounting his experiences at the University of Sydney some 20 or 30 years earlier. And he said to me, "My daughter had a lovely time at your home last week." And it stopped me in my tracks. I frankly didn't know what he was talking about. I didn't recall having had anybody's daughter, let alone the professor at the Singapore University, at my home the previous week. But we went on, and he pointed out that his daughter had attended a cast party. My daughter had been the producer of the University Review that year, and the official residence where we were living in Sydney had a separate area where you could have cast parties to your heart's content. And that is exactly what my daughter had organised, and his daughter, who was then a student at Sydney University, had been a member of the cast. And I did find it a rather touching experience, because it drove home to me just how important, in a personal sense and in a public diplomatic sense, if I can put it that way, Australia's involvement in providing higher education to the young men and women, particularly of our own region, how important that had been. I want to talk about our experience from the perspective of a head of government, recognising that my responsibility was not only to building higher education, but my responsibility, of course, was also, as the governments at a federal and state level in your country have, the challenge of balancing budgets and spending the taxpayer's dollar in the most wise manner possible. Now, the basic facts are that about 15% of the regular revenue stream of Australian universities now comes from international students. That is welcome. It's at a very high level, and as the Governor said, on a per capita basis, Australia attracts the highest number of international students of any country in the world. Now, what are the reasons for this? I think that there are some generic reasons, and there are also some particular reasons as a result of individual policies of governments. Generically, we of course are located cheek by jowl geographically with the fastest growing region in the world, the Asian region. We have of course the great advantage of speaking English. English is the lingua franca of Asia. Although more people in Asia speak languages other than English because of its universality, it is the language that links the countries of Asia. Something in the order of 31% of all the students at international students that is, at Australian universities come from China. About 13 to 14% of them come from other parts, some 13 to 14% come from India, the rest, of course, from different parts of Asia, Europe, and some indeed from North and South America. I think another generic reason is that way back in the 1950s, just after the end of World War II, Australia's government made a very conscious decision to reach out to countries in our region, which at that time had a relatively poor secondary and tertiary education infrastructure. And through what was known as the Colombo Plan, we began to provide scholarships to Asian students to study in Australia. Now, that was at a time that some of you will know when Australia had what was called a White Australia policy. It wasn't until 1967 that Australia began to admit in any numbers immigrants from Asian countries. Prior to that, we had been a nation that had taken immigrants overwhelmingly until, of course, the end of World War II from Britain and Ireland. And then after World War II, we took large numbers of immigrants from Eastern and Southern and Western Europe, and then progressively from the Middle East. And we changed for good the White Australia policy in 1967. And now, interestingly enough, the most widely spoken foreign language in Australia is Chinese, a combination of Mandarin and Cantonese. And it's a token of the way in which the involvement of our country in our region and the way in which our attitudes and our culture has been changed and enriched by that involvement, how far that process has come. And that is relevant to the context of what different governments over the years have done in Australia. I think it's also fair in providing context to the Australian experience to make a couple of observations about the structure of our education system. At a university level, there is not anywhere near the same private involvement in universities in Australia as obtains in the United States, where probably, 30 to 40% of your universities are private. In Australia, the percentage is very low indeed. The great bulk of them are state universities. They are established under state government law, although for a long time they have been federally funded. That contrasts, interestingly enough, with the primary and secondary education system in Australia, where something like 34% of all Australian students at a primary and secondary level are now educated at private or independent schools. It's a very, very high percentage, and that 34% includes students attending very high-fee private or independent schools, but also students attending very low-fee private or independent schools. And we have a very elaborate system of direct government funding of independent schools in Australia, where something up to 70% of the total cost of educating a child at the low-fee independent schools is provided by the government. I just mention that to provide some of the context which is different from the background of education in the United States, both at a primary and secondary level and also at a tertiary level. But returning to the reasons why we have been so successful in attracting a large number of students, international students, I mention some of the generic reasons, but there are also some very particular reasons. And they relate very much to decisions that have been taken by governments over the years. We took a decision in the 1980s to allow unlimited entry of international students, subject, of course, to satisfactory visa arrangements, provided they paid the full fees and provided they met the necessary entry qualifications of the various universities. The second and very important decision that was taken in 1997, not long after my government came to office, was to establish a very direct link between the intake of international students and our skilled migration program. And we changed the requirements to provide that it would be possible for somebody completing a qualification at an Australian university to apply while remaining on shore in Australia for admission under the skilled migration program. Australia, of course, has continued to maintain over the years a steady intake of migrants, and part of that intake places a very heavy emphasis on skills, obviously those skilled occupations which are in most demand in our country. And that decision that was taken to establish a direct link between the education of international students and their ability off the back of that education to gain admission as skilled migrants into the country provided a very significant spur to the interest in coming to Australian universities. And it was not only, of course, to universities that so many students came and continue to come over the years, but also to what we call vocational education generally. They are colleges and other institutions, many public, some private, which provide an education not of a university level, but leading to trade and other qualifications. So that decision, taken in 1996 or 97, I forget which year, but it matters not, provided that very, very important link. And at a time when the demand for skilled migrants was very strong in our country, the interest was growing, particularly in our own region. It provided a very, very valuable spur. And then a few years later, a further change was made which gave greater credit to training and education at an Australian tertiary institution in assessing whether somebody would be admitted as a skilled migrant or permanent resident. That provided an additional spur along with giving an enhanced status to somebody who was able to speak the English language with a degree of proficiency. So I think it's fair to say that that decision in particular, which really provided people with the incentive of possibly being a skilled migrant to Australia at a time when the Australian economy was growing and expanding and was seen as providing plenty of opportunities for highly qualified and highly trained people. It did provide a quite dramatic boost to the appeal and to the attractiveness of being educated at an Australian university. Now, I wouldn't want any of you to imagine that all aspects of this program, if I can call it that, over the years has been plain sailing. We have, in fact, had some glitches over the last 2 or 3 years which have put a bit of a dent in what had been continuous growth. A couple of years ago, we had a number of incidents, particularly in Victoria, involving alleged discrimination against Indian students. There had been several attacks on Indian students. After very careful investigation, it was established that those attacks, most of them had been random and indeed were not related to the fact that the people attacked had been Indian. But unfortunately, those facts didn't get in the way of a good story. One of the very attractive things about India to me as a country compared with China is that India has a very robust and open and free media. Now, you may think it's very strange for a politician, a former politician, to extol the virtues of these open and vigorous and free media, but let's face it, it is one of, painful though it is on occasions for all of us, it is one of the great cornerstones of our democratic way of life. And one of the very big differences between these two fascinating giant countries, India and China, is that the media in China is still very heavily censored, very heavily controlled, whereas the media in India, I can assure you, goes absolutely berserk at the first available opportunity. And that, of course, happened very much with the saga of how Indian students were being treated in Australia. And it's also fair to say, and I don't say this in any spirit of partisanship, because I can happily report that both sides of politics in Australia are very strongly committed to having a very heavy international component in our universities as far as the student body is concerned. There were some changes made by the government that replaced my government at the end of 2007, which tightened up some of the visa requirements due in no small measure to some elements of rorting or abuse. I don't think the expression rort is used so frequently in the United States as it is in Australia, but it's it's a lovely generic expression to describing all manner of cutting corners and cheating the system. And the rorting had occurred in relation to some colleges providing higher education, and there was some tightening up, but as a result of that, things were tightened a little too much, and it was one of the glitches. And the final glitch, of course, has been in recent years has been the strength, particularly over the last 18 months, the strength of the Australian dollar. When we left office, the Australian dollar was about 75 cents to the American dollar. A couple of months ago, it had climbed to about 108. It's now come back below parity. And speaking from an Australian perspective, you might say, I like it to be very high. It's a matter of pride, not really, because a very high dollar, as Americans are conscious of in relation to the Chinese currency, can reduce the competitiveness of a nation's exports. And of course, as the Governor said in introducing me, higher education has become our greatest service export. Therefore, we don't want it to become increasingly expensive. Indeed, higher education is now Australia's third largest export of any kind. Decades ago, it used to be said that Australia rode on the sheep's back, and that was true not only in a sentimental sense, but it was also true in an economic sense, because we had such a large slice of the world wool market. Now, as the years have gone by, that's changed. Our largest export now is coal, and the second largest is iron ore, and the third largest is higher education. And it is a very valuable emblem of the commitment that our country has made to globalisation, but it's also a realistic assessment of the continuing limits on the availability of public funds for university and other tertiary level education. And as I said at the commencement of my remarks, this is something that all governments have to grapple with. I know that this is overwhelmingly a gathering of men and women involved in the administration in every aspect and the running and the future and the philosophy and the values of universities in your country. And of course, your country boasts the very best universities that can be found anywhere in the world, but you, along with me, would not be blind to the reality that side by side with that, you face many challenges about the continuation of the university infrastructure in the United States as we do in Australia. And of course, from a government point of view as well as from a university point of view, we need to keep university education within the affordable reach of as many citizens as possible. And the basis of any fair and free and open and democratic society is the availability at an affordable cost to all the citizens of a country of an education that will allow a person to achieve the best that his or her talents can deliver. And that's a philosophy and a goal that I know is dear to American hearts as it is to Australian. Now that involves obviously a contribution from the general taxpayer. It involves a contribution from the individual, because a university education does enhance people's capacity to earn higher amounts of money after leaving university. And it also charges the administrators of universities with the responsibility of running them as efficiently as possible, and in partnership with governments putting in place policies and approaches which are going to maximise revenue sources from all available sources. And that, of course, is where we have seen the opportunities that are our lot because of where we are and who we are where we are in our part of the world. And we've been able to establish this very, very strong stake with international students. We, of course, years and years ago had an experiment, would you believe, with free university education. We used to charge people to go to university, but then we provided what were called Commonwealth, after the Commonwealth of Australia, which is the full description of our country, scholarships based on academic achievement at school, and that funded the attendance of something like 35 to 40% of students at universities, and then sundry other cadetships and scholarships accounted for about another 40%, so that about 80% of them were being helped in one way or another with tuition fees. And then in the early 1970s, the newly elected Labor government of Australia under Gough Whitlam decided that it would make sense and be fair and equitable to abolish fees altogether. And that was tried, and it stayed in operation for something like, I think, 15 years. It did not alter in any significant way the socio-economic background of the student intake. It was done in the name of equity, and that was a noble aspiration, but in reality it didn't alter the socio-economic background of the student intake. And in the late 80s, another Labor government, might I say with the strong support of my side of politics then in opposition, decided to introduce a system of what was called a higher education charge, whereby in effect students were required to make a contribution to the cost of receiving their university education to be paid either up front with a significant discount, or alternatively to be paid out of post-graduation income once that income reached a higher level. Now that system has been amended and patched up and altered over the years, but it still largely remains in place, and we now have a situation where about 25% of the cost of educating somebody is contributed one way or another by the student, and the other 75% from direct government assistance or other revenue streams, such as full fee-paying students from overseas. And without complicating the picture too much, for a period of time under my government, full fee-paying students who missed out on a funded Commonwealth place at a university. Now, that's just a very brief and I hope not confusing description of the different ways in which we have approached the challenge of funding. But to get back to the core business of what I want to talk to you about this morning, and that is the role of international students. It has been quite successful in Australia. Now, we've been lucky because of where we are geographically, the language we speak, the fact that our universities are well regarded in our region and around the world. And I think it's fair to say that Australian universities over the years have been very well administered. They have their flaws, they have their challenges, but they've been responsible for a lot of innovation and they have been very successful institutions if you take a broad outlook. And the success that we have had is very much part of the story of Australia over the last 40 or 50 years, a country which is profoundly part of Western civilisation, a country that has very strong and deep and enduring links with your country, without in any way suggesting it's the only criterion of the partnership between nations. Australia, of course, is the only country in the world that has fought beside the United States in every major conflict in which your country has been involved since the First World War. And the many values that we hold in common with the United States, and of course, because we are part of the projection of Western civilisation in our respective parts of the world. But the story has been of an Australian nation, although maintaining all of those things and being emblematic of those things, we have determinedly set out in building a very close involvement in our part of the world. And I look back on my time as Prime Minister, and I remember, as one does when one looks back on a political career, you remember some of the decisions and events of substance, as well as some of the very important symbolic events. And I remember in October of 2003, a very important event took place in our national capital. On the first of 2 days, we had a joint sitting of our House of Representatives and our Senate, and although Australia has a Westminster-style parliamentary and cabinet system, we named our two houses of parliament after those of the United States because we are a federation, and some of our constitution was copied from the constitution of your country. We had a joint sitting of the House and the Senate, and that was addressed by the then President George W. Bush. And then the very next day, we had another joint sitting, and we don't often have these joint sittings. We've probably only had about 8 or 9 of them in the last 100 years. The very next day, we had another one, and it was addressed by the current Chinese President, Hu Jintao. Now, there was quite a lot of symbolism in that, because here was Australia's closest ally and security partner, the United States, and no better and older friend than the United States to Australia. And the very next day, the President of China, very much part of Australia's future, as well as very much part of our present economic strength. And what was interesting to me about it as the host was the complete acceptance within the Australian community that this was an important message. We were in no way backing from our very close alliance with the United States, and I welcomed the then President, who was then and remains now a very good friend of mine, to Australia. But I was also very happy to welcome the leader of a country that is still an authoritarian country, but a country that was increasingly important to Australia. China is now our largest export destination, and incidentally, Australia is the preferred destination for Chinese who wish to study overseas. So it's a very important country to us, as it is indeed to you. But I mention those things to emphasise that the involvement of international students in the Australian higher education story of the last 40 or 50 years is a natural product of the stance that Australia has taken politically and strategically and economically over that same period of time. I started my remarks mentioning a personal experience that I'd had in Singapore, which drove home to me the long history of this international student involvement in Australia. And the contribution that those international students make to our country and to the funding of our universities is part of a broader contribution that kind of link makes, not only to funding but also to the projection of Australia in a soft power way, if I can borrow, I think it is Joe Nye's expression. Countries project soft power and hard power. The bigger and stronger you are, the more hard power you project. But it's also a good idea for big countries to project soft power as well as hard power. And that education experience has proved absolutely invaluable to the relations that Australia has had with the countries of our region. And as I started with a personal anecdote, let me finish with one at a more public diplomatic level. Many of you know that in 1999, Australia led the United Nations sanctioned intervention in East Timor after a referendum had voted for East Timor to separate from the Indonesian Republic. Now, this caused a very significant strain in the relationship between Australia and Indonesia. And Indonesia is our nearest neighbour. It's a nation of more than 200 million people. It's now the third largest functioning democracy in the world. And it's also the nation with the largest Islamic population in the world. And it's right on our doorstep. So as you can imagine, good relations with Indonesia rate more than a passing mention when you're thinking about Australian diplomacy. And that intervention in East Timor caused quite a lot of strain. And I went through a period of time after the intervention had taken place where the Indonesian president at the time was reluctant to talk to me. He wouldn't take my telephone calls. That eased after a relatively short period of time. But one of the things that I was told by our then ambassador to Jakarta, Rick Smith, and which I believe was certainly the case on the basis of what other people had told me, was that one of the things that stopped the relationship deteriorating further was the fact that there were a very large number of people in senior positions in Indonesia, in the government, in the military, in business, and indeed in academia, who'd been to Australian universities. And the fond recollection of that and the bonds that have been established helped keep the temperature down. And equally, Australia went through a very difficult phase in her relations with Malaysia a few years ago. When Malaysia had a Prime Minister called Dr. Mahathir, he didn't like my Labor predecessor, Paul Keating. He came over a period of time not to like me. He didn't like Englishmen. He grew over time not to like many Australians either. He didn't seem to demonstrate in the policies when he was Prime Minister to want to give a fair go to the minority Chinese population of his country. And once again, it was a case that below the surface, where relations were very strained, it was the alumni of Australian universities, stretching right back to the days of the Colombo Plan, which prevented that relationship deteriorating even further. In fact, of all the countries in the world, Malaysia on a per-head basis, has the largest alumni of Australian universities of any nation. Now that, over time, could be challenged by others, but at present, and indeed for quite a long time, that has been the case. So these are examples, and I'm told that a very significant percentage of the current cabinet of the government of Vietnam have also been educated at Australian universities. Now, all of these things add up to this involvement being something above and beyond, important though it is, the provision of a very reliable and additional revenue stream into the funding of our universities. And it does represent in every way a very successful and quiet but enduring projection of the values of our country into a region that will be forever important to our future. I want to thank the organisers of this conference, Academic Partnerships, and Governor Bush and Governor Hunt for inviting me to participate. I've enjoyed, again, as I said, being in the United States. I value very much the opportunity of exchanging ideas and expressions of interest with citizens of your country, and again, my warm thanks for having me along. Now, if there are any questions you want to ask me, please go ahead.
Prime Minister, thank you very much. Please help us all understand how you might respond to criticism within your own country by people who might say we have limited space in our best universities, which are being taken by people of foreign extraction, or we are helping educate individuals in time of scarce resources who are not paying taxes to the extent that we are, and so on. These are issues that some of us face, and regardless of which side of the question you belong to, it's still an interesting question of how you handle that.
Well, I can only speak at it from our perspective. Those questions do come up. And we've had an ongoing debate in Australia about whether we should allow full fee paying local students access to our universities over and above the Commonwealth or government funded places. Now, when we were in office, we allowed that because our argument was that if it's all right to have foreign students paying full fees, why can't you have local students paying full fees? For, I think, reasons of, in my view, misguided ideology, the other side of politics in Australia said, oh no, we only want government-funded places available for local students. And they're now in the process of phasing out full-paying local students. Now that's one way, in my view, you meet that objection. I think there has been a change in public attitudes in Australia over the last 20 years to the importance of countries in our region to our economic future. There was a time 2 generations ago when a lot of Australians saw nations such as China and Japan as sources of cheap labour and therefore a threat to Australian jobs. Now, there are still a lot of Australians who feel that way, not so much about Japan, but about China and other countries in our region. But equally, over the years, there's been a maturing appreciation of how important the nations of North Asia are to Australia, and this has been accelerated in the last few years. There were 2 reasons why Australia didn't take the bullet or dodge the bullet in the global financial downturn. The first was that we entered that downturn in very strong fiscal shape. We had no debt and we had a budget surplus, and that really fireproofed us. And the second reason is that our economy was linked into North Asia, particularly China. And I think the Australians understand that countries like China are very important to us now, whereas 20 years ago, and certainly 2 generations ago, they didn't. And when there was a debate a couple of years ago about the imposition of a super tax on the profits of mining companies, which the Australian government then proposed, and there was quite a strong reaction against it from the mining industry. And interestingly enough, the general public didn't like the idea because they thought that mining industry was pretty important to our economic survival because we sold all this coal and this iron ore to China, and that was pretty important. So I think there's, while you do get that attitude that, look after our own, charity starts at home, why should we provide these plates? And that's still there, and it will always be there, but I think it's less intense because we're able to say, no matter who's in government, look, these countries are very important to us, and China, the biggest source now, takes all of our coal and iron ore, and that's very important. The thing is a two-way street, so I think that will help. Now, the extent to which those kind of arguments are as strong in your country, you are the best judges of that, but there's certainly some of the reasons why we've been able to sort of handle that, deal with it.